Hello, welcome to the New Stack Context, a podcast where we review the week's hottest news in cloud-native technologies and look ahead to topics we expect will gain more attention in coming weeks. Today, we're talking with Eric Sammer, distinguished engineer at Splunk, about the company's ongoing effort to rename its whitelist, blacklist, and master-slave terminology to remove language that perpetuates systemic racism and unconscious bias in tech. Splunk brought together a working group of people from across the organization to develop additional recommendations, guidelines, and procedures to identify and replace biased language and to prevent other instances from happening in the future. So we're going to talk with Eric about that today. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Also joining us today is managing editor Joe Jackson and senior editor Richard McManus. And I'm Libby Clark, editorial and marketing director at the New Stack. And I just want to say happy Juneteenth, everyone.
Happy Juneteenth.
Woohoo! My new favorite holiday.
Exactly right. We're starting to see some more meaningful changes in response to the recent Black Lives Matter protests. And this includes, but it's not limited to, some recasting of the potentially offensive IT terminology. And it also includes commemorating Juneteenth as an official company holiday. Several tech companies have made that change. And they're now marking the day in 1865 that Black slaves in the U.S. learned that they were free. So happy Juneteenth. So Eric, could you fill us in a little bit on your background and what your role is at the company and how you first became involved in this effort to rename exclusionary language?
Yeah, sure. So just a tiny bit of background. I've been with Splunk creeping up on 3 years now, joined by way of acquisition. So I was the CTO and co-founder of a company called Rokana that Splunk acquired a couple of years ago. And so at Splunk, there is a team, doesn't really have a great name, but internally we refer to as core architecture that is made up of a bunch of senior level technical individual contributors. And so I'm on that team, and my role sort of reporting into our CTO, Tim Tolley. So my role is mostly to be sort of glued at the hip with our product management leaders and our engineering people leaders, helping with technical direction, technical growth, sort of, I guess what I would call sort of like bottom up technical leadership. So I spend a lot of time talking with various engineers and product managers about how we're going to do, what we're going to do. And so my focus is cloud platform, all the buzzword compliance stuff, multi-tenant, cloud native, Kubernetes, next gen, so on and so forth, platform for Splunk applications and infrastructure. So it's things like everything from identity management, access control, data storage, stream processing systems. And then I have counterparts that focus on some of the other areas like application experiences and search and indexing and stuff like that. So that's my day-to-day. As for how I got involved in this, I mean, quite frankly, and I think we have a blog post out if folks haven't checked it out, it's really sort of a good description of sort of how this came to our attention. I mean, even within Splunk, when I joined, Splunk had this strong desire to get away from some of the more what I would consider overt, like obvious terminology that is racist or at least aggressive in the technology. So things like master slave, which is very, very, very pervasive in distributed systems and in the corners of the world that I run in, to get into more sort of neutral terminology. And in this particular instance, a partner of ours, actually by way of our ideas portal, which is like one of the ways in which both customers and partners and sort of the Splunk sort of community interacts with us in sort of product leadership roles. One of our partners said, hey, like this language is pretty crap, right? Like, maybe you guys like want to do something about this. And I have to say, like, one, it's a little embarrassing that it's still out there, right? And I think it's important that we not sort of pat ourselves on the back for sort of doing something about it. It's just sort of good human responsibility to do something about it. But when we saw this, immediately a bunch of technical and product leaders at Splunk immediately said, hey, like this is something we should absolutely do something about. There wasn't, quite frankly, a whole lot of debate about it. Whether or not this was the right thing to do. The conversation was immediately about, okay, how do we do this in a way that doesn't wildly disrupt life for our customers? Because some of this language exists in places like configuration and stuff that's in version control and actual like APIs in certain cases. And so the question is, okay, like we want to do something about it now. How do we do that? And so we formed a group inside of Splunk, sort of a working group, attached to a specific initiative, made up of a cross-functional group of folks that sort of have the ability to advocate for these kinds of changes, help them happen, sort of thread it through the organization in all the right places. And so I'm a part of that. Senator Kumar, our chief product officer, is obviously spearheading that and sort of driving that forward. And I think it just really helps to have that kind of leadership all the way up to the SVP or sort of E-staff level with folks like Sender to be able to address this.
What sort of response have you had from the community so far in terms of changing the language? Because a lot of these words have a really long history, like blacklist, for example, was first used in the 17th century, I believe. So have you had any sort of kickback from some of the community about this?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in certain cases, there's some people who say, what's the deal, right? These are just words. We've used them for a long time. They have lots of definitions. Look, they're in the dictionary, right? There's multiple definitions for the word master. And so what's the big deal? And, I'll level with you, and this might sound, really direct, but like I come from a world where when somebody says, hey, this thing hurts me, you just stop doing it. Right. And like, it's not necessarily about, what I think. I do think the right thing to do here is to make these changes, but, language evolves, we learn, we grow as a society. There's ingrained stuff that I think just makes sense to question and challenge and change. And if we didn't work that way, then we never would have had things like civil rights movements and all this stuff. And like, let's be super clear, right? Changing master slave or whitelist, blacklist, and these kinds of things as words does not end systemic racism in the US, in technology. It doesn't fix, but it certainly removes one more way that we convey the notion that white equals good and black equals bad, right? The blacklist is the bad list. The whitelist is the good list. And so like from my perspective, I look at that and I kind of go like, I feel like I understand that people say like, well, they're just words and stuff like that. They go like, but look, they're just words to you, but like they send a message, and I just think that we should be receptive to that as, quite frankly, as like a white guy in tech, I am in a position to make certain kinds of changes. And I think like this is, to me, what I've learned, some portion of allyship is about is like, when somebody says something, you respond to it.
Terrific. I'm very curious, how much work would it take or did it take Splunk to change out this terminology? I mean, is it just the documentation? You had mentioned APIs. Does it involve going into a lot of files and making lots of changes, or is this something that could be scripted? And also, I'm very curious, in your estimation, how much work would it be for other companies who would want to try something similar?
Yeah, I mean, it is true that it's not free. Right. It is not simply search and replace for, documentation. It appears in source code in a bunch of different places. And the real tough stuff, I mean, that stuff can like generally be refactored. And maybe there's a little bit of sort of, teaching people that, the leader and the worker are like the new names. And, not that those are names I think we've settled on, but just like as an example, the real tricky stuff is where this appears in, like I mentioned earlier, configuration files where companies, customers, partners may have things that they have built on top of Splunk that sort of rely on that terminology. It's hard coded in how customers sort of interact with the software. And so just like any backwards incompatible change, right? We sort of think about, well, how do you bring customers along on this? Because on one hand, you want to do it and you want to be decisive about making these changes. On the other hand, if you break all of your customers, they are going to wind up resenting that change, which actually creates a different kind of problem, where, people who might be skeptical of even making the change now have a really good reason to like latch on to why they can't make this change, why that's impossible. And so part of this working group is made up of, a bunch of engineers, and there's discussions about how do we do this. And the short answer is like, there's a couple of techniques that you would use to make any sort of backward incompatible change like this, like for some period of time for a directory. And I think there's a directory somewhere inside of Splunk called like, where the actual name on the file system is like master-apps or master config or something like that. And that's a place we have to change. And our field team, which is involved, says, hey, people version control that directory. Like you can't break that. And so in this instance, the way we deal with this is we actually, for some period of time, support both. We sort of prefer the new language and the new directory name. If the old one exists and the new one doesn't, we use the old one. If the new one exists and the old one doesn't, we use the new one. If they both exist, we prefer the new one, right? And we tell people that. And then after some period of time, potentially with things like, we're looking at techniques like automated migration tools, like all these other things where customers can sort of deal with the renaming of those kinds of things, we'll support that for some period of time. And then we'll sort of deprecate and remove, over some life cycle, the old terminology. And we can do that with APIs. We can do that with directories. We can do that with config files. And so the short answer is like, look, it's as hard as you want it to be. And if it's important, you find a way. And I think that, it's on us to make these changes. There's lots of ways in which, societies have been built around, bad stuff. And it takes a long time to undo the bad stuff. But eventually it makes sense to do. It's worth doing it. And like, this is worth doing. And I don't see any reason why other sort of enterprise software companies and open source projects and stuff like that can't also make these changes. I think a lot of projects have started doing this, but some haven't. And I think that this is, it's as good a time as any to make those changes.
It's interesting that you mentioned the effect on your customers and how you kind of need to bring them along with you on this. And in that way, it's almost, a leadership role. And I'm wondering if there are other things that you've identified in terms of, with the work you've been doing with your working group about identifying bias and the leadership role that you can take as a company.
Yeah, we certainly try and be thoughtful about this. We also know that we're going to, at times miss things. And so we rely on feedback from customers and partners. We rely on feedback from people within the organization. Having people in the organization that are, made up of, a range of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different genders, different races, so on and so forth, helps us to identify this stuff much faster. Turns out, like if you have a monoculture in a company, you don't spot these things because everybody kind of thinks the same way. So as we take in this feedback, that's one primary channel, but there's certain other things that I think we're starting to learn about as an industry that are in some ways, probably even more significant in the negative impact. We talk a lot about bias and machine learning models. And like training, the models reflecting the biases of the person training them. And like, listen, like we talk about like, well, data doesn't lie. Data totally lies if you're not careful. If you train a model based on only certain kinds of data, it's going to reflect that bias in the decisions that it makes. And if you're not sort of aware of that, it's going to do really, really terrible things. And we've seen some of the side effects of that, where people have models that sort of adopt racist terminology because like the internet decides to train it, to say terrible things. There's like this whole big thing that I learned about at some point where like cameras film couldn't capture people with darker skin tones for a long time. And like there's this whole thing about sort of how the film was built for people with like lighter skin tones and stuff. Like the bias seeps out there, in all of the things that we build. Software is not different, and I think we just it's on us to sort of be cognizant of that, especially as we start using software to do things like make automated decisions about, good actors and bad actors, good traffic, bad traffic, who gets home loans and who doesn't get home loans, right? Like this has ways of like radically impacting people's lives in ways that are, can reinforce, already existing horrible situations. So I just think it's something that, is on us to think about as we build this stuff.
So in the developer community, there's been issues of sexism in the past, things like Gamergate. What's your sense of the diversity of the developer community in terms of racism? I mean, are there enough Black developers out there, for example, and are their voices being heard?
It's a really interesting question. And I'll level with you, like, I am not an expert on some of this stuff. Based on my own reading and my anecdotal observations, I would say you can walk into a conference and just sort of look around and you will see, I think, an absence of, on the whole, you will see far less women, you will see far less Black engineers, it looks a certain way. And I think that does a disservice to us, as a society. Like I said, when you start thinking about these are the people that are training models and stuff like that. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is to the exclusion of white engineers or anything like that. I think people get caught up in that stuff. This isn't, either or. This is about sort of giving people all the same opportunities, I think that we have. So yes, I think that it's pretty pervasive. I think there's many, 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 many talented Black engineers, women in engineering. They are some of our pioneers, across all of these different dimensions. There's nobody who's just inherently better at engineering or building software. That's just not true. Do they have a voice? I think objectively not enough, right? I don't think you see it. I think there are a bunch of industry leaders who are Black, who are women, who have strong voices. But I don't think that is nearly as prevalent as like white men in tech. And I think that that's just like objectively true. It doesn't take a whole lot of research to figure that out.
Terrific. Hey, I want to go down the Wayback Machine. And the last time we had covered your previous company, Rakana, before it was acquired by Splunk, was we did something back in 2015. And I'd love to get an update since then. But first of all, what was Rakana offering for microservices monitoring, and what was appealing to it for Splunk?
Yeah, Rakana came out of a lot of what my co-founders and I had seen while we were at Cloudera, which was sort of like what people were doing with all of this like big data infrastructure, Hadoop and HBase and things like Flume and later things like Kafka, Spark, and Flink. And there was always a lot of talk about like, hey, like a lot of these use cases are actually machine data. Right. Almost all of these use cases are about data generated by machines because that's where the big stuff comes from. Excuse me. And so, what would it look like, to productize some of the most common use cases? And so we had sort of approached it very much from that direction, which led us on a path that was largely competitive with Splunk. I mean, they were the behemoth in that space, arguably still are. So so that's how we had approached it. And we had focused very much on event data.
Okay.
Of all kinds. So time series and discrete events and security events and stuff like that. So I'll level with you. I don't know that we ever thought about it. And I won't feel like I can say we were sort of visionaries about microservices and stuff like that.
But, time, yeah.
Right. I mean, but I do think
driven, that's
that,
it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But the idea that we could have all of the data across services to build a complete picture. And we sort of knew that the world was distributed and stuff like that. And so I guess in that respect, we sort of understood it. But it was really about being able to scale and correlate events across services. These days, we have things like, distributed tracing and stuff like that is much more common, and so I think that the world has evolved in a good way there. And we think about that stuff a lot at Splunk today.
Nice. I wanted to ask you, I'm not sure if you're the person to ask at Splunk, but we've been hearing a lot about the importance of a full observability, the three pillars: logging, tracing, I forgot the third one, but
metrics.
Metrics, yeah, of course. So we haven't caught up with Splunk in a while. What are you guys doing in this front, and what are you offering for your customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So the stuff that we are monitoring or sort of trying to observe has absolutely changed, right? 10 years ago, there was none of this Kubernetes. There was none of service meshes weren't a thing, like all this kind of stuff. And so the idea that the tooling that we have to run this stuff, either as engineers or SREs or DevOps people or sysadmins, whatever you want to call people, has to change, seems really intuitive, right? So as the software becomes more complex and distributed, your tooling needs to be able to handle that complexity and that all the sort of robustness around that. And so at Splunk, we always have a mix of stuff we build internally and then sort of watching the industry. I think Signal Effects was very interesting to us. And I was lucky enough to sort of be part of the team that was looking at this. And so these guys at Signal Effects, I think had very much the right sort of thinking around observability all up. And again, it isn't specifically about logs or metrics or traces. The goal is to know that the system is up and alive. And the answer is we will take in whatever data we need to get that done. Signal Effects, we made that acquisition about a year ago now, more tightly integrated with the business these days. We also acquired a company called Omnition that was specifically focused on distributed tracing. And focused on specifically modern cloud architectures, distributed systems, and full fidelity tracing of absolutely everything that happens there. So Signal Effects had this fantastic metrics engine, arguably one of the best out there. Omnition had this fantastic forward-looking distributed tracing technology. We've brought those things together, right? So they're available today, from Signal Effects. And of course, Splunk has this sort of deep sort of history with log and event data. And so again, we're starting to bring those things together as well to give people a full picture. So really, I think it's about bringing the tooling forward along with sort of the complexity of the technology. Does that make sense? Am I talking crazy?
No, that's what we're hearing across the industry as well. So everybody's kind of moving towards the same point.
Yeah, great.
Well, Eric, it was really good to have you on the show today. I want to thank you for Splunk's efforts in renaming the exclusionary language and for your personal allyship. So thanks for joining us on the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to get a chance to talk to all of you.
Next up, we have our podcast of the week from NewsStack publisher and founder Alex Williams.
Why third-party security adoption must get better is the podcast of the week. I interviewed Chenxi Wang. Chenxi is someone we've known for a long time. She's now managing general partner of Rain Capital. I asked Chenxi what she would think are the greatest challenges that developers and security teams face these days.
I can tell you, sure, multiple personas exist, right? They exist on premises as well, and they continue to exist in the cloud. But the trend that I am seeing is that there's blurring distinctions between the multiple personas because things need to move faster. So the dev may be taking on ops roles, and also the dev may be taking on networking management roles, manager roles, because software stack is the full stack needs to manage certain parts of the networking operation as well, right? And it just cannot be I put in a request for my network manager to change the configuration on the firewall, and a week later he changes it, then I can do my thing. It just doesn't work. So the firewall in the cloud needs to have APIs for dev to manipulate. Now, is dev? Is dev network ops? be blurring, right? So that's the trend. So if you say that, I would agree with you.
Firewall APIs are a good example of what confusion can take place and why things need to be more automated than ever before. And that's going to really be the trick, it seems, with getting developers to participate more in security, just having it be done for them so they don't have to wait for permissions. That's it. That's my podcast of the week.
Thanks, Alex. This podcast was also a preview of the upcoming State of Cloud Native Security virtual summit that the New Stack is doing with Prisma Cloud by Palo Alto Networks. That's coming up on June 24th. And you can learn about more about cloud native architectures and methodologies and what benefits they're seeing in deployment and management in cloud environments. So go check that out on the newstack.io and register now for that event. Richard, I'd like to hear from you now. What new articles do you have for us from our sponsors this week?
Yeah, one of the sponsor articles that we had actually relates to our guest today. Chris Tosey, on behalf of LogDNA, wrote a really good post about what the cloud native technology stack means for log management. And he pointed out in his post that in cloud native environments, you typically work with microservices architectures where there could be a dozen or more different services running, and each of them has a different log. And he also noted that there are more layers of infrastructure with these technologies. So again, more logs. So their servers, obviously, he was kind of plugging their servers in a way because it collects data from all these different parts of the environment and aggregates it into a single location. But I think it was a really interesting post because it does, I think, show the opportunities that the Kubernetes ecosystem has opened up for companies like LogDNA and Splunk to come in and offer solutions that kind of solve some of the problems that complexity of Kubernetes introduces to developers and operators.
Awesome. Thanks. This is a nice timely pick for our podcast today. Joe, what else do we have on the site this week?
Oh, we got a lot of great stuff on the newstack.io this week. First of all, our analyst who works with us, Jana Karim MSV, has launched an exclusive series about the Google Cloud Platform's Kubernetes service, Anthos. This is a terrific deep dive. Each part of the series focuses on a different aspect of Anthos. The series covers cluster registration, configuration management, click to deploy applications from the marketplace. And Anthos is an important piece of technology here, insofar as it's an answer to helping fight container sprawl. We talked last week with Ben Heineman from D2IQ about the growing problem of container sprawl and how different business units might set up different Kubernetes clusters, and then everybody's configuration's a bit different. It just turns into a headache. But just as Kubernetes, as the Kubernetes controller maintains the desired state of application deployments, stateful sets, and daemon sets, Anthos, which you could think of as a meta control plane, ensures that the entire cluster maintains a desired state of configuration. So he had started this. There's a couple posts this week on the site, which we'll put the links to. And in particular, the latest edition, we learned that you can use Anthos to control not only Kubernetes clusters on the Google Kubernetes engine, but also on Amazon Web Services, Elastic Kubernetes service, and the Azure Kubernetes service as well. So it provides some multi-cloud management there. So that's pretty interesting.
Nice. I know Johnny's tutorials are always good. He does really in-depth tutorials around Kubernetes, especially.
And he's doing some other projects for us around Kubernetes too, right?
Yes, indeed. He is writing an ebook for us right now on the Kubernetes ecosystem. It's coming out at the end of July, so that's pretty exciting.
There you go. So look forward to that. Another story we had is a kind of a little bit of a mystery and I guess a little bit of a thriller for those who are really into coding anyway. David Castle had found a programmer who actually recreated Apollo 10's lost software. This is a fascinating story. Apollo 10, I guess the space geeks may know this, but few others, paved the way for the historic Apollo 11 moon landing by testing the lunar landing module concept. This is where it breaks off from the main spacecraft and is supposed to land on the moon and come back up afterwards. Unfortunately, for that mission, the Apollo 10 mission, only one known copy of this code is known to exist, and that's on the actual lunar landing module, which as of right now is still hurtling on its way into the sun. That was the original idea. So we're not going to get that code back, but this gentleman had found the draft of the code that had almost the complete program, as well as the complete code for the follow-up Apollo 13 mission. He pieced together the rest. It's really quite fascinating. Through the clever use of checksums, he was able to find out what code was missing and then recreate that code. And he knew he had the right code only when the checksum matched the original, the checksum of the original code. So go ahead and check that article out. Sit down, grab a cup of coffee. It takes a good 10-15 minutes to read, but it's well worth the effort.
The code was hurtling into the sun. I love that.
It's hurtling into the sun, yeah.
Brings a different meaning to disaster recovery.
Right? Not going to get that one back.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for being on the show again this week. And thanks again to Richard and to our guest, Eric from Splunk. We'll catch you again next week on the New Stack Context. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Context at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.